The fluorescent lights of the courthouse hallway hummed with an almost sinister monotony as 8-year-old Emma sat rigidly on the wooden bench outside courtroom 7. Her small legs dangled above the polished floor, her white patent leather shoes, specially purchased for this day, gleaming under the harsh institutional lighting. Her mother had insisted on new shoes, as if presentable footwear could somehow shield her daughter from the nightmare unfolding around them. Emma clutched the fabric of her pale pink dress in her trembling hands, the color a deliberate choice meant to make her look innocent, vulnerable, young. Everything about today had been carefully orchestrated by adults who understood that juries responded to certain narratives, certain images. A child in pink, a service dog, a victim, the pieces of a story meant to convict. Beside Emma sat a magnificent golden retriever whose coat gleamed like burnished honey in the courtroom lights. Unlike Emma, appeared perfectly calm, his large amber eyes soft and intelligent, occasionally blinking slowly as if he possessed some ancient wisdom. To the casual observer, he was simply a well-trained dog. But Emma knew better. Had been her constant companion for the past 6 months, ever since the nightmares began in earnest, ever since she stopped sleeping through the night, ever since her voice had nearly disappeared entirely. The dog had been introduced to her during a therapy session at the Family Crisis Center, and from the moment his warm nose pressed against her hand, something had shifted. Here was a being who asked nothing of her except her presence, who didn't require explanations or justifications, who simply existed beside her with unconditional acceptance. Ms., the lead prosecutor assigned to Emma's case, emerged from a nearby conference room, her arms laden with case files and legal documents. She was a woman in her late 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes and the kind of presence that commanded a room. She'd been doing this work for 15 years, handling cases involving the most vulnerable members of society, and the toll was visible in the tight set of her jaw and the premature gray streaking her dark hair. She knelt beside Emma with practiced gentleness, her business suit crinkling as she bent down to the child's level. Ms. had learned long ago that prosecution wasn't about courtroom dramatics or legal maneuvering. In cases like this, it was about helping a child find her voice. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Ms. asked, though she already knew the answer by looking at Emma's pale face and white-knuckled grip on her dress. Emma's response was barely audible, a whisper that seemed to dissolve into the humming of the fluorescent lights. "Scared," the child managed. Ms. nodded, unsurprised. She'd heard that word countless times before. She reached into her briefcase and extracted a small laminated card with simple illustrations. "I want to remind you about something very important," she said, her voice taking on a calm, instructional tone. "Do you remember what we talked about in all those practice sessions?" Emma nodded slowly, her eyes flickering toward. The dog's head had tilted slightly, as if acknowledging the beginning of their ritual. Ms. pointed to the first illustration on the card, a simple drawing of a hand moving downward. "This is your signal, remember. When things get too scary, when you feel like you can't breathe, when the questions are too mean or too confusing, this is what you do." She demonstrated the gesture slowly and deliberately, a subtle downward motion with her hand. It wasn't dramatic or obvious. To anyone watching who didn't know the signal, it would appear as nothing more than a child resting her hand. That was the point. The defense wouldn't even see it coming. Emma practiced the signal 3 times, her small hand mimicking Ms.'s movement with increasing confidence. Each time, its response was immediate and precisely calibrated. The dog didn't jump or bark or create a scene. Instead, he would shift his weight, press his solid 90-pound frame more firmly against Emma's leg, and sometimes rest his chin gently on her lap. It was a response born from months of training at the specialized service dog facility, where had been taught to recognize trauma responses and provide grounding through physical presence. But there was something more than training in its reactions, something that suggested the dog truly understood what Emma needed. "Perfect," Ms. said encouragingly, squeezing Emma's shoulder. You're doing so well. Remember, this signal is just between you and it's your secret way of telling him you need help. And when he feels you, he'll remind you that you're not alone, you're safe, you're in control." She paused, letting her words settle into Emma's consciousness. "The judge knows about your signal. Judge is a good woman and she understands why you need with you. She's going to make sure you're protected in that courtroom." But even as Ms. spoke reassuringly, Emma could hear sounds from within the courtroom, voices, the shuffling of papers, the creak of the judge's chair being adjusted. Through the small window in the courtroom door, she could catch glimpses of the jury box being arranged, of court officers performing their pretrial preparations. In approximately 30 minutes, that door would open, and Emma would be led inside to face the man who had shattered her entire world. Her Uncle Robert. The thought of Robert made Emma's stomach churn violently. She could almost smell his cologne, that expensive men's fragrance he always wore. She remembered the sound of his voice when he told her to keep their special secret, remembered the way her small body had frozen in terror, remembered the overwhelming sense that what was happening wasn't real, couldn't be real, must be something from a nightmare she would wake up from. Except she had woken up, and the nightmare continued. For 3 months it had continued. "Emma," Ms. said gently, reading the panic blooming across the child's face. "Look at me." Emma forced her eyes to meet the prosecutor's. "He can't hurt you anymore, that's why we're here. The law is going to protect you now. I'm going to protect you. Judge is going to protect you." And she gestured to the dog, whose amber eyes seemed to glow with fierce protectiveness. "We'll remind you that you're strong enough for this." Emma reached down and wrapped her small arms around his neck, burying her face in his golden fur. The dog remained perfectly still, allowing her this moment of vulnerability, his warmth and solid presence the only thing keeping her from flying completely apart. When she finally pulled away, there were tears on her cheeks, but her jaw was set with determination. She had been practicing for this moment for months. She knew her testimony. She knew what she needed to say. She knew that her voice mattered. Through the courtroom window, Emma caught a glimpse of her uncle being led to his seat. He was dressed in an expensive charcoal suit, his hair perfectly groomed, his expression confident and dismissive. He looked like he didn't have a care in the world. He looked like a man who had never done anything wrong in his entire life. He looked in every conceivable way innocent. And that was exactly why he was so dangerous. Ms. stood and extended her hand to Emma. "It's time," she said simply. Emma took a deep breath, stood on shaky legs, and placed her hand on his head. Together, the three of them, woman, child, and dog, walked toward the courtroom door. Emma's heart pounded so hard she thought it might break through her ribs, but with each step she felt steady presence beside her, grounding her, reminding her that she wasn't alone. The courtroom doors loomed ahead, heavy and wooden and impossibly large. Emma whispered too, so quietly that only the dog could hear, "We've got this, right, boy?" His tail wagged once, deliberately and with purpose. Then they stepped through the doors together into the light. The courtroom was a theater of contained chaos as Emma and Ms. entered through the side door reserved for witnesses and prosecution personnel. The space was larger than Emma had imagined during her practice visits. The high ceilings stretched impossibly upward, the walls paneled in dark wood that seemed to absorb sound and gravity alike. Everything smelled of old leather, furniture polish, and something indefinable that Emma would later realize was the scent of institutional power. Fluorescent lights cast everything in a slightly sickly glow, and the massive judge's bench loomed at the front of the room like a throne in some medieval castle. His ears swiveled, taking in every sound, every movement in the space. The dog had been trained for courtroom environments, but Emma could feel the slight tension in his muscles, a subtle acknowledgement that this place was different from anywhere else they'd been together. Ms. guided Emma to the witness preparation area, a small, enclosed section where she could wait without being visible to the defendant or his legal team. It was a mercy, a small protection built into the system specifically for vulnerable witnesses. Through a partially frosted glass partition, Emma could see silhouettes moving in the courtroom proper. She recognized the outline of Judge, a woman in her early 60s whose reputation preceded her, fair but uncompromising, intelligent but not unkind. Emma had met with her in chambers once, a brief conversation designed to make the judge seem less intimidating when Judge had asked Emma questions gently and had even allowed to sit beside her. That small gesture had meant everything. The courtroom gallery was beginning to fill. Emma could hear the murmur of voices, the shuffle of feet, the creak of wooden benches as spectators settled into their seats. Some of them were journalists. She could tell by the professional quality of their voices, their rapid-fire conversations about legal precedent and the newsworthiness of the case. A successful businessman accused of child abuse. It had all the elements of a compelling story. There were also community members, people who had known Robert Hayes, who were here to see if the pillar of their community would be exposed as a monster. And there were advocates, volunteers from the Children's Crisis Center, people who made it their life's work to support survivors. Emma found some comfort in knowing they were here, that she wasn't completely alone in a room full of strangers. Then the energy in the courtroom shifted dramatically. A door at the back of the courtroom opened, and bailiffs in dark uniforms escorted a man through. Even from her vantage point behind the frosted glass, Emma recognized him immediately. Robert Hayes, her uncle, the man who had stolen something from her that she was still learning to reclaim. He moved through the courtroom with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. His suit was perfectly tailored, undoubtedly expensive, charcoal gray with a subtle pinstripe that probably cost more than Emma's mother made in a month. His shirt was crisp white, his tie a sophisticated navy blue with a pattern so fine it was barely visible. Everything about his appearance screamed success, respectability, legitimacy. This was a man who had engineered his presentation with the precision of someone who understood optics and perception. He was a product manager in the corporate world, a man whose job involved selling ideas to boards of directors. He understood branding. He understood how to make people believe in his carefully constructed image. Robert's hair was slicked back with expensive product, not a strand out of place. His watch, Emma had heard her mother say once, gleamed at his wrist. He carried himself with the ease of someone accustomed to privilege, to getting his way, to being believed. His lawyer, a tall man named, walked beside him wearing an equally impressive suit and an expression of supreme confidence. Had been brought in from a prestigious law firm in the city, someone with a reputation for destroying witnesses on cross-examination, for turning trials into games where he was always the victor. Emma had heard the prosecution team discussing him nervously during one of their preparation sessions. He was good, very good, and he was being paid an astronomical sum to make Emma's accusations disappear. Robert's cold gray eyes swept across the courtroom, cataloging every face, assessing every potential juror with the calculated gaze of a hunter. And then his gaze found Emma. He was looking directly at her through the frosted glass partition, as if he could see through it with the force of his will alone. His expression transformed, not into remorse or shame, but into something far more disturbing. A smirk, an actual smile. His lips curved upward in an expression that screamed contempt, dismissal, and something else that Emma's 8-year-old mind struggled to process, but her body understood immediately. He felt no fear. He believed he would win. He believed that whatever she said wouldn't matter, that his lawyers would shred her testimony, that his money and status would insulate him from consequences. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Her vision seemed to tunnel. The fluorescent lights suddenly felt too bright, the air too thick to breathe. Her small hands began to shake. This was real. He was here, and in moments she would have to face him. It was response that saved her from drowning in panic. The dog's entire body transformed. His relaxed posture shifted into something taut and alert. His ears, which had been gently drooping, pinned back against his skull. His amber eyes, usually warm and soft, hardened into something ancient and primal. Every muscle in his 90-pound frame seemed to coil like a spring. But he didn't bark. He didn't lunge. Instead, he stepped directly in front of Emma, positioning himself between her and the frosted glass, between her and the predator on the other side. The dog's head tilted upward, his nose working, catching the scent of Robert's cologne even through the barrier. Hackles raised slightly, creating a ridge of golden fur along his spine that made him appear larger, more formidable. Ms., standing nearby, whispered urgently, "Easy, boy. Stay." The dog obeyed the verbal command but didn't relax. His body remained in full protective mode, a living shield between his girl and danger. Through the frosted glass, something remarkable happened. Robert's expression changed. The smirk faltered for just a moment. His confidence seemed to crack, if only fractionally. He straightened in his chair, suddenly more aware that his presence was being observed, that there were forces in this room he hadn't anticipated. His lawyer leaned over and whispered something urgently in his ear. Robert waved him off dismissively, but his earlier absolute certainty had been tarnished. Judge, from her elevated bench, observed everything. She had been a judge for 3 decades, had presided over countless trials, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people. She noticed the dog's reaction. She noticed the defendant's momentary loss of composure. Most importantly, she noticed the profound terror on the face of the small child behind the glass partition. She made a mental note, filing away the observation for later consideration. The trial hadn't even officially begun, and already the dynamics were more complex than they initially appeared. Emma's mother, seated in the gallery behind the prosecution table, gripped the edge of the bench so hard her knuckles turned white. She had encouraged her daughter to be brave, to tell the truth, to believe in the justice system. But watching her daughter's panic from across the room, watching that predator smirk with such casual cruelty, doubt crept in like fog. Could the system really protect a child? Could truth really triumph against money and power and sophisticated lawyers? The courtroom fell into a strange silence as everyone settled into their seats, as the weight of what was about to happen pressed down on everyone in the room. The bailiff called out the official opening. The judge instructed everyone to rise, and the machinery of justice began its grinding motion. In the witness preparation area, Emma knelt down and wrapped her arms around his neck, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. The dog rested his chin on her small shoulder, his body communicating what his voice could never express. "I will not let anything happen to you." Emma whispered to him, barely audible. He looked at me like he won. His body tensed slightly, as if promising, "Not today, not here, not while I'm breathing." The trial was about to begin. The courtroom fell silent as Emma was called to the witness stand. Her small legs carried her forward with leaden slowness, each step feeling like it required an immense act of will. Ms. walked beside her, maintaining a professional distance but offering silent support through her steady presence. Moved alongside Emma, his leash held loosely by a courtroom bailiff who had been specially trained to work with service animals. The judge had made clear that the dog would be permitted to remain with the witness, an accommodation that had taken weeks of legal maneuvering and precedent-setting discussions. Emma climbed onto the witness stand, which had been specially modified with a cushion to elevate her so she could be seen by the jury without appearing ridiculous in the oversized chair. A children's Bible was brought forward for her to place her hand upon instead of the standard adult Bible. She swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, her voice barely audible even with the courtroom's sophisticated microphone system amplifying her words. The court reporter, a woman with weathered hands and a practiced neutrality, positioned herself to capture every word. The prosecutor, Ms., began gently. Her questions were designed to establish foundation, to help Emma acclimate to the courtroom environment, to build her confidence before she would have to face the defense. "Can you tell us your name? How old are you? Where do you live?" Simple questions with simple answers. Emma responded in whispers, her eyes darting toward the jury box where 12 strangers watched her intently. Some of their faces were kind, others were harder to read. She couldn't tell if they believed her or if they thought she was a liar. Ms. guided Emma through the establishment of her relationship with Robert. How often did you see your uncle? Did he ever visit your house? Did you ever go to his house? These foundational questions were crucial. They established opportunity and trust, the building blocks of any credible accusation. Emma answered each question, her voice growing marginally stronger as she realized that this was just the beginning, that she could do this. Lay on the courtroom floor beside the witness stand, his chin resting on his paws, but his eyes remained alert and fixed on Emma. The dog never looked away from her face, monitoring her emotional state with the precision of a medical instrument designed specifically for detecting trauma responses. The mood in the courtroom shifted as Ms. moved toward the substantive allegations. She asked Emma about the specific date of the first incident, asking her to describe what she was wearing, what television show was playing, what toys she had been playing with. These sensory details were the hallmark of truthful testimony, the specificity that false accusations typically lacked. Emma provided them haltingly, her voice shaking as she described a day that had fundamentally altered the trajectory of her life. Judge leaned forward slightly, her experienced eyes missing nothing. She was already impressed by Emma's consistency, by the way the child provided details that didn't sound rehearsed, that had the quality of genuine memory rather than scripted performance. Then the judge nodded toward the defense table. "Your witness, mister," she said formally. Rose from his seat with theatrical slowness, as if the act of standing up was a profound undertaking. He buttoned his jacket with deliberate precision, adjusted his already perfect tie, and began his approach toward the witness stand with the calculated movements of a predator. His face had been arranged into an expression of concerned benevolence, the face of a man genuinely troubled by false accusations, deeply invested in uncovering the truth, a champion of justice for all parties involved. "Good morning, Emma," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that felt like oil spreading across water, slick and false. I represent Mr. Hayes. I just have a few questions for you, okay?" Emma nodded mutely, her grip tightening on the edge of the witness stand. "Now, you and your uncle were very close, weren't you?" began, his tone remaining deceptively friendly. "You spent a lot of time together, family gatherings, holidays, that sort of thing." "Yes," Emma whispered. "Speak up a little louder for the court reporter, would you?" asked pleasantly. "The jury needs to hear you clearly." "Yes," Emma repeated slightly louder. "In fact, you loved your uncle, didn't you? He was like a favorite family member." The question was a trap. Emma could feel it, though she didn't have the sophisticated legal training to articulate why. If she said yes, she was admitting closeness that could be twisted into consent or confusion. If she said no, she was being inconsistent with what she'd told her therapist. Either way, she lost. I liked him," Emma said carefully, her voice wavering. Pounced on the hesitation. "You liked him, or you loved him, which is it? Because your mother told police officers that you said your uncle was your favorite person to spend time with. Was your mother lying?" Emma's eyes widened, her small hands began to shake. No, she wasn't lying, I did. I thought I did before." "Before what?" interrupted, his tone still pleasant but his eyes now predatory. "Before you decided to make these accusations, or before your mother told you what to say." "Objection," Ms. stood sharply, argumentative and assumes facts not in evidence. "Sustained," Judge said, her voice taking on a subtle edge. She looked at meaningfully. "Counsel, stick to questions." But the damage was already done, had planted the seed. What if the mother had coached the child? What if this was a custody issue masquerading as abuse? Continued his assault with the precision of someone who had perfected this technique over decades of trials. He asked about the difference between dreams and reality. "You know the difference, right, Emma? Sometimes children have very vivid dreams that feel real, but they're not actually real." "I know the difference," Emma said quietly, her voice becoming smaller with each answer. "And sometimes children's memories can get confused, especially after adults ask them questions over and over again. Have the police asked you questions? Have doctors asked you questions? Have therapists asked you questions? Emma nodded miserably, understanding that she was being painted as a malleable, unreliable witness, whose memories had been contaminated by repeated interrogation. So it's possible that all these questions have confused your memory, that what you think happened might actually be something else entirely. No, Emma said firmly, the first real conviction in her voice. I know what happened. But was already moving past her answer, already reshaping it, already recontextualizing it. He asked about her relationship with her mother, suggesting that perhaps the girl was so desperate for her mother's approval that she would lie to please her. He asked about whether Emma had ever told a lie before, forcing the child to admit that, yes, she had told lies, small, inconsequential childhood lies like saying she had eaten her vegetables when she hadn't. Once Emma had admitted to being capable of dishonesty, smiled. It was a subtle expression, but the jury saw it. And in that smile was the implicit message, this child lies. Emma felt tears beginning to blur her vision. Her breath came in shorter, shallower gasps. Her hands had begun to tremble so badly that she nearly dropped the glass of water a bailiff placed beside her. His response was immediate and profound. The dog stood from his resting position and placed his front paws on the platform of the witness stand, his head now level with Emma's. His amber eyes locked onto hers with fierce intensity. The dog leaned forward and gently pressed his nose against her arm, not the subtle grounding technique they had practiced, but something more urgent, more desperate. Was communicating at a visceral level, I see you. I believe you. You are not alone. Paused for just a moment, briefly thrown off his rhythm by the dog's unexpected movement. But he recovered quickly, returning to his calculated assault of questions designed to sow doubt, to paint Emma as confused or manipulated or attention-seeking. Yet as continued his relentless questioning, the jury's attention had shifted. They were no longer looking at Emma, they were watching, and the dog's unwavering protectiveness was communicating something that no amount of legal maneuvering could obscure. This was a child who needed protection. This was a child who was terrified, and no healthy child would be this terrified unless something truly terrible had happened to her. Judge observed everything from her elevated bench, her expression unreadable but her mind processing the subtext of what was occurring before her. The trial had moved from the realm of testimony into something more fundamental, a battle between carefully constructed narrative and raw, instinctive truth, had been cross-examining Emma for 47 minutes. The clock on the courtroom wall ticked forward with agonizing slowness, each second stretching into an eternity for the traumatized child in the witness stand. His technique was masterful, a relentless rhythm of questions that never quite allowed Emma to fully explain anything, that twisted her words and recontextualized her trauma into something that sounded increasingly implausible with each new angle of attack. So you're saying, said, his tone carrying the false sweetness of a predator offering candy to a child, that your uncle did these things to you but you didn't tell anyone for 3 days. Is that correct? Emma's voice had become barely audible, a whisper struggling against the amplification of the courtroom microphone. I was scared. You were scared, repeated, his inflection suggesting skepticism. Scared of what exactly? Scared that you would get in trouble, scared that your uncle would be angry with you. Scared that no one would believe me, Emma said, the words emerging like she was pulling them from deep underwater, each one an effort. But your mother believed you immediately, didn't she? Pressed, moving closer to the witness stand. She didn't doubt you for even a moment. She took you to the police. She took you to the hospital. She initiated this entire legal process. So really, you couldn't have been that frightened that no one would believe you because your mother did believe you right away. The logic was twisted, deliberately corrupting the simple truth that Emma had tried to express. But the jury was listening. Emma could feel their skepticism mounting like a physical presence in the courtroom. What this lawyer was suggesting made sense on the surface. If the abuse was real, wouldn't the child have reported it immediately? Wouldn't there be more physical evidence? Wouldn't the behavior be more obvious? Emma's breathing had become shallow and rapid. Her small fingers gripped the edge of the witness stand so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Beads of sweat had begun to form on her upper lip, and her eyes had taken on the glassy quality of someone beginning to dissociate, to retreat into herself as a survival mechanism. Sensed the escalation immediately. The dog's posture had shifted from protective to deeply alarmed. His ears were fully pinned back now, his eyes wide and focused entirely on Emma. He whined softly, not allowed in courtroom protocol, but a sound that emerged from his emotional core, regardless of training. The bailiff holding his leash glanced at Judge, uncertain whether to silence the dog or allow him to continue his apparent communication with the traumatized child. Sensing weakness like a shark detecting blood in water intensified his assault. In fact, Emma, isn't it true that you're confused about what actually happened? That you've told so many different versions of this story to so many different people, your mother, the police, the doctors, your therapist, that you don't even remember the original event anymore? No, Emma whispered, but the denial sounded feeble even to her own ears. No, raised an eyebrow, his expression dripping with theatrical concern. You're not confused, or no, you do remember the original event. Emma opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. The trap had been perfectly constructed. Any answer she gave would be wrong. Any clarification would be twisted into further doubt. She was drowning and was holding her head underwater while asking her to explain why she couldn't breathe. I know what happened, Emma finally managed, her voice cracking with desperation. I know it was real. You know it was real, repeated, his tone suggesting that he was genuinely interested in exploring her claim while simultaneously implying that her knowing something was real and it actually being real were two entirely different matters. But knowledge can be unreliable, can't it? Especially for an 8-year-old child whose memories have been contaminated by repeated questioning. It was at this moment that Emma reached what psychologists would later describe as acute dissociative crisis. Her vision seemed to tunnel. The courtroom sounds became distorted, as if she was hearing them from underwater. The faces of the jurors blurred together. Continued questioning became a meaningless drone. She could feel herself slipping away, could feel consciousness fragmenting into pieces. Her small hand trembled as it moved downward, the signal she had practiced hundreds of times. But this time, it wasn't a controlled, deliberate gesture. This time it was the desperate motion of a child drowning, reaching for a life raft with the last of her strength. Response transcended training. The golden retriever erupted from his resting position with the force of a coiled spring released. He leaped onto the witness stand platform with surprising grace for a 90-pound dog, his powerful back legs propelling him upward with athletic precision. His front paws landed on the railing of the stand, and his massive head rose above Emma's seated position, creating a living barrier between her and. But it was the dog's next action that would later be discussed in legal circles for years. Turned his entire body toward Robert Hayes, who sat at the defense table approximately 20 feet away. The dog's eyes locked onto the defendant with an intensity that seemed to contain decades of accumulated protective fury. His body went rigid. His lips curled back, revealing his teeth in a display that was absolutely primal, absolutely terrifying, and absolutely unmistakably directed at the man in the charcoal suit. What emerged from his throat wasn't quite a bark and wasn't quite a growl. It was something deeper, something more ancient, a sound that seemed to come from the evolutionary core of canine protection instinct. It was a warning. It was a threat. It was a visceral, undeniable communication that this dog would defend his charge with lethal force if necessary. The courtroom erupted in gasps and movement. Several jurors visibly recoiled. A woman in the gallery actually stood up, shocked by the sudden display of raw animal power. The bailiff holding leash struggled to maintain control, but the dog's attention was so intensely focused on Robert Hayes that the leash became almost irrelevant. Robert Hayes's face went pale. His confident posture collapsed. He shoved his chair backward several inches, as if the additional distance would somehow shield him from the dog's penetrating glare. His lawyer instinctively stepped back from the witness stand, his carefully constructed demeanor cracking for the first time since cross-examination began. He looked genuinely frightened. Judge stood from her bench, her gavel raised halfway to strike, but she paused. She simply watched, because in that moment something had become absolutely clear to everyone in the courtroom. Animals don't lie. Dogs don't perform. They don't understand courtroom psychology or legal maneuvering or the value of reasonable doubt. What was communicating was pure, unfiltered truth, the recognition of danger, the protection of the vulnerable, the visceral knowledge that something profoundly wrong had occurred. Emma, despite her dissociative state, seemed to anchor herself on this moment. She reached out with her small, trembling hand and placed it on his head, her fingers tangling in his golden fur. The contrast was stunning. A tiny, traumatized child grounding herself through contact with her protector. Two beings communicating across species in a moment of pure, authentic connection. The courtroom had gone absolutely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers frozen above the keyboard. This moment, this singular moment of a service dog's protective instinct intersecting with a child's desperate need for validation, had shifted something fundamental in the room's atmosphere. Judge slowly lowered her gavel. Her eyes moved from Emma to Robert Hayes, and in that gaze was the accumulation of 3 decades of judicial experience, and the certain knowledge that she had just witnessed something that transcended the normal mechanics of trial testimony. Remained frozen several feet away from the witness stand, his face a mask of uncertainty. The carefully constructed narrative he had been building, the confused child, the manipulated memory, the unreliable witness, seemed suddenly paper-thin in the face of absolute certainty. Robert Hayes, meanwhile, could not look away from the dog. His hands had begun to shake noticeably, visible even to the jurors seated several rows back. His supremely confident posture had collapsed entirely. The facade was cracking. Judge's voice cut through the silence with surgical precision. "The witness will take a brief recess," she announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Counsel, approach the bench, now." As the bailiff carefully guided down from the witness stand, the dog's eyes never left Robert Hayes. His message had been delivered with perfect clarity. The trial had fundamentally transformed in that single moment. The silence that followed Judge's directive was absolute and profound. It was the kind of silence that only exists in moments of genuine rupture, when the ordinary rules of a situation have been fundamentally violated and no one quite knows how to proceed. The bailiff, who had been holding his leash, gently guided the dog down from the witness stand with careful, measured movements, as if sudden motion might shatter the fragile hold on courtroom decorum. Descended, but his body remained tensed, his eyes never leaving Robert Hayes. The defendant sat rigidly in his chair, his face the color of old parchment, his earlier confidence transformed into something resembling genuine fear. Emma remained in the witness stand, her small hand still outstretched toward where had stood moments before. Her breathing had stabilized somewhat, though tears continued to stream silently down her pale cheeks. The dissociative episode that had been threatening to consume her had been interrupted by something stronger. The need to maintain contact with her protector, the anchor that kept her tethered to reality and safety. Stood several feet from the witness stand, his carefully constructed persona visibly fractured. His jaw was set tight, and there was a new quality to his expression, something resembling genuine uncertainty. In his 2 decades of legal practice, had encountered many dramatic moments in courtrooms, but he had never before witnessed a dog's protective instinct override years of professional training. He glanced at his client, Robert Hayes, seeking guidance, but found only a man whose confidence had evaporated like morning dew under an unforgiving sun. Turned back toward Judge, his earlier swagger replaced by a cautious professionalism. The jury was transfixed. 12 ordinary people who had been seated in the jury box for hours, listening to testimony and legal arguments, had just witnessed something that transcended legal procedure. A woman in the front row, a middle-aged mother of 3, was openly crying. Her hands gripped the armrests of her seat as if she might otherwise fly apart. A man in the third row had his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles beneath his skin seemed to vibrate with tension. Another juror, an elderly gentleman in the back, was shaking his head slowly, his expression one of dawning, horrified comprehension. The collective psychological impact of this display rippled through the jury box like waves through water. In the gallery behind the prosecution table, Emma's mother sat with both hands covering her mouth, her entire body trembling with suppressed emotion. Beside her, representatives from the Children's Crisis Center leaned forward, their faces masks of intensity. One woman squeezed Emma's mother's shoulder, a gesture of support and solidarity. Around them, journalists frantically scribbled notes, their minds already composing the headlines that would accompany their stories of this unprecedented moment in the courtroom. Judge stood at her elevated bench, her expression one of contemplative authority. She had served 30 years on the bench and prided herself on her understanding of human nature, her ability to read between the lines of testimony and legal maneuvering to discern underlying truths. But this moment had moved beyond the traditional tools of judicial analysis. What she had witnessed was the intersection of judicial process and raw, primal truth, a moment where animal instinct had communicated something that hours of expert testimony and cross-examination had struggled to convey. The judge gestured to the bailiff. "Please ensure the dog is secured comfortably in the witness preparation area, provide water and ensure his comfort." She then directed her gaze to the attorneys. "Chambers, now, we need to discuss what just occurred and determine how we proceed." As Ms. and made their way toward the judge's private chambers, whispered urgently to his client. Robert Hayes had shrunk into his chair, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like an ill-fitting costume. His hands continued to shake slightly, and there was now a fine sheen of perspiration on his upper lip and forehead. Whatever carefully constructed defense he had been planning seemed suddenly inadequate in the face of what had just transpired. The courtroom doors to the judge's chambers closed behind the attorneys, leaving the larger courtroom in a state of suspended animation. Judge gestured for and Ms. to sit across from her desk. Her chambers were decorated in the traditional style of judicial offices, floor-to-ceiling containing decades of case law, diplomas from prestigious universities, photographs of the judge with various political figures and legal luminaries. But in this moment, all that accumulated authority and precedent seemed less important than the fundamental truth that had just been displayed in her courtroom. "Let me be clear about what I just witnessed," Judge said, her voice calm but carrying undertones of steel. "That dog did not perform trained behavior. That was not a rehearsed response. What I observed was a genuine protective instinct directed at the defendant with such intensity that it transcended normal animal behavior." Attempted to speak. "Your Honor, the dog's reaction is not admissible evidence. The jury cannot base their verdict on an animal's emotional response." "I'm aware of the rules of evidence, counsel," Judge interrupted, her tone suggesting that explanation was unnecessary and somewhat insulting. "I'm not suggesting that the dog's behavior constitutes admissible evidence. What I am acknowledging is that I have observed something that informs my judicial understanding of this case. The dog's reaction reveals a truth about the emotional reality in this courtroom that transcends legal technicality." She turned to Ms. "Ms., your witness is clearly in severe psychological distress. I'm going to call a recess. During this break, I want her to receive support and stabilization." Her emotional state is deteriorating, and I will not allow her to be further traumatized on the witness stand." Then she addressed directly, "Regarding your cross-examination, counsel, I found your line of questioning to be inappropriate for a witness of this age and psychological state. You were engaging in a deliberate intimidation strategy designed not to elicit truth, but to confuse and destabilize a traumatized child. That ends now. When we return to the courtroom, I will be implementing new parameters for questioning. The witness will not be subjected to further aggressive cross-examination, designed purely to shake her credibility through psychological manipulation." Face flushed. "Your Honor, the defense has a constitutional right to cross-examine witnesses." "You will cross-examine this witness," Judge said firmly, "but you will do so within boundaries designed to protect a child from psychological abuse. There is a difference between rigorous cross-examination and deliberate cruelty. You cross that line. Significantly." Back in the witness preparation area, Emma sat curled against the side, her body small and fragile against the dog's solid, warm presence. The bailiff had provided her with juice and cookies, but Emma hadn't touched them. She was focused entirely on the tactile reassurance of his fur beneath her fingers, on the steady rhythm of his breathing. The dog was calm now, his protective fury having dissipated, but his attention remained entirely fixed on the child. He occasionally licked her face with gentle sweeps of his tongue, as if trying to communicate that the threat had passed, that they had survived. Ms. found them in this configuration and knelt beside Emma. "You were so brave," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "So incredibly brave. Do you know what just happened out there?" Emma shook her head mutely. "Showed that jury exactly how much he believes in you. He showed them that you're telling the truth. Sometimes words aren't as powerful as what we show people through our actions, and just showed everyone in that courtroom that you're not lying, that you're a child who needs protection, not a child who's making things up." The trial resumed after a 45-minute recess. The energy in the courtroom had fundamentally shifted. The jurors looked at Robert Hayes differently now, not as a presumed innocent businessman, but as a man who had provoked such genuine fear in an animal that the dog had abandoned all training to protect the child. Whatever psychological warfare had been waging against Emma's credibility seemed suddenly irrelevant in the face of what the jury had witnessed. Judge addressed the courtroom. "We will proceed with the witness testimony," she announced. "However, the parameters of cross-examination will be more carefully monitored. This court exists to determine truth, not to traumatize vulnerable witnesses." Emma returned to the witness stand at her side, but something had changed. The dog's protective display had shifted the balance of power in a way that no legal argument could have accomplished. And as began his resumed cross-examination with noticeably more restrained questions, the jury's attention remained fixed not on whether they believed Emma, but on why Robert Hayes looked so terrified of a dog that was simply telling the truth. Judge's chambers were a sanctuary of judicial authority, lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes of case law, legal precedent, and decades of accumulated wisdom. The afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across her mahogany desk. As Ms. entered, the air seemed to thicken with tension. This was no longer a routine procedural meeting. This was a moment where fundamental principles about the conduct of trials would be examined and potentially redefined. Judge remained standing behind her desk, her posture communicating that this would be neither a casual conversation nor a particularly lengthy one. She gestured for the attorneys to be seated, but her own body language suggested she would remain standing, maintaining the physical advantage that her elevated position already provided. She removed her reading glasses and set them carefully on her desk, a gesture that signified this discussion would transcend the technical minutiae of legal procedure. "Let me be absolutely clear about what I observed in my courtroom approximately 30 minutes ago," Judge began, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority tempered by genuine emotional response. That was not a trained response. That was not performance. That was a genuine, visceral protective instinct. In my 30 years on the bench, I have seen service dogs perform their trained functions. This was entirely different. Shifted in his seat, preparing his counterargument. Your Honor, with all due respect, the dog's emotional response cannot and should not inform the jury's evaluation of the evidence. The defendant has a constitutional right to cross-examine witnesses, and that right cannot be compromised by the jury's emotional reaction to an animal's behavior. I'm not finished, Judge interrupted, her tone cutting through subjection like a blade through silk. You're correct that the dog's behavior is not admissible evidence. However, what I witnessed was a child in acute psychological distress being subjected to interrogation tactics that bordered on psychological abuse. Your cross-examination, mister, was designed not to elicit truth but to confuse, destabilize, and intimidate. You used every psychological manipulation technique in your considerable arsenal to attack a witness who is 8 years old and dealing with genuine trauma. Opened his mouth to protest, but Judge raised her hand, silencing him before he could speak. I have read the transcripts of your previous trials. You have a well-documented pattern of aggressive cross-examination that has been effective in many cases. However, the Supreme Court has consistently held that while vigorous cross-examination is protected, the protection extends only insofar as the cross-examination seeks to reveal truth. Your questioning today was designed purely to create reasonable doubt through intimidation and psychological manipulation of a child. Ms. sat quietly, allowing the judge to complete her analysis. She knew that judicial momentum was now moving in her favor, but she also understood that Judge was not making this ruling based on sympathy. The judge was grounding her decision in constitutional principles and the fundamental purpose of the judicial system. Furthermore, Judge continued, I have a responsibility to protect vulnerable witnesses, particularly children, from psychological harm during testimony. That responsibility does not disappear simply because the Constitution protects cross-examination. There is a balance that must be struck between the defendant's right to confront witnesses and the court's obligation to prevent the abuse of that right. She moved to her desk and pulled out a file containing detailed notes she had been taking throughout the trial. I have documented instances where you posed the same question multiple times, each time with increased aggression when the witness gave consistent answers. You posed hypotheticals designed to suggest that the witness was confused or fabricating. You specifically attacked her memory and credibility through techniques that have been shown in psychological research to be particularly damaging to children who have experienced trauma. Judge turned her attention directly to, I understand you're doing your job. I understand that defending your client vigorously is your professional obligation. However, your professional obligation does not extend to the psychological destruction of a child. There is a line, mister, and you crossed it. She then addressed both attorneys. Here is what will happen when we return to the courtroom. The witness will provide her testimony with the service dog maintaining physical contact. This is not a concession to sentiment. It is a recognition of the neurobiological reality that trauma-informed support improves testimony reliability. Research consistently demonstrates that traumatized witnesses provide more accurate and consistent accounts when they have grounding support present. Ms. made a note, knowing this judicial ruling would be groundbreaking for future cases involving child witnesses. Second, Judge continued, cross-examination will proceed but with specific parameters. Questions must be clear and not compound. Questions designed purely to confuse or intimidate will be ruled out of order. Aggressive tone will be tempered through judicial intervention. The witness will be permitted brief breaks if she becomes emotionally. And any attempt to re-traumatize the witness through aggressive questioning will result in immediate intervention by this court. Started to speak. Your Honor, this essentially prevents effective cross-examination. No, Judge said firmly. It prevents abusive cross-examination. There is a profound difference. You will still have the opportunity to ask the witness difficult questions. You will still have the ability to test her credibility. What you will not have is the ability to use psychological intimidation and emotional abuse as a trial strategy. She stood and walked toward the windows, looking out at the city below. I became a judge because I believe in the American legal system. I believe in the constitutional protections afforded to defendants. I believe in the principle that a person is innocent until proven guilty. But I also believe that those principles must be applied in a manner that reflects our values as a society. And I do not believe that our values include the psychological destruction of an 8-year-old child. Judge turned back to face the attorneys. What I witnessed today was something that transcended legal procedure. That dog did not attack your client, mister, but his behavior communicated something profound about the emotional reality in this courtroom. A child was in such genuine distress that even an animal trained to remain calm was moved to protective action. That tells me something fundamental about the truthfulness of her testimony. She returned to her desk and sat down, her decision finalized in her mind. The prosecution will have the opportunity to re-examine the witness to address any points raised during cross-examination. Then, barring any further developments, the case will proceed to closing arguments. I expect both sides to respect the parameters I have outlined. Ms. gathered her materials, understanding that she had been granted something unprecedented, judicial protection for a vulnerable witness, without compromising the defendant's constitutional rights. It was a delicate balance, but Judge had articulated it with precision. As stood to leave, he made one final attempt. Your Honor, might I suggest that perhaps we should consider a continuance? Allow the witness time to stabilize emotionally before resuming testimony. No, mister, Judge said. That suggestion tells me you understand that your previous cross-examination was, in fact, damaging to the witness. A continuance would only delay the inevitable conclusion of this case. The witness will testify today. The jury will render their verdict based on the evidence presented. Justice will proceed. When the attorneys returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted again. Judge's face remained professionally neutral, but her bearing communicated that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. She addressed the courtroom formally, articulating her new parameters for cross-examination in language that was technically complex, but clearly designed for the jury to understand. This court recognizes that witnesses, particularly young witnesses who have experienced trauma, require certain accommodations to provide their most reliable testimony, Judge explained. The service dog will remain in physical contact with the witness. Questions will be clear and direct. The witness will be permitted breaks. Cross-examination will proceed, but in a manner consistent with the principles of justice and human dignity. Was brought back into the courtroom and positioned beside Emma's chair. The dog immediately responded to her presence by pressing his body against her leg and resting his head on her lap. Emma's fingers tangled in his fur, and her breathing seemed to stabilize immediately. Returned to his questioning, but his approach had fundamentally changed. The aggressive intensity had been replaced by a more measured, cautious tone. He still attempted to challenge Emma's testimony, but without the psychological warfare that had characterized his earlier cross-examination. Judge interrupted several times, redirecting questions that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. And the jury watched it all, watched how the judge protected the child, watched how the dog remained constant at her side, watched how a small girl continued to speak truth despite the attempts to silence her. By the time concluded his cross-examination, something fundamental had shifted in the courtroom's moral architecture. Justice was no longer an abstract concept discussed in legal terms. It was embodied in the form of a frightened child, a faithful dog, and a judge committed to ensuring that truth prevailed over manipulation and intimidation. Emma returned to the witness stand at her side, but something fundamental had shifted within her. The protection that Judge had articulated, the boundaries that had been established, the unwavering presence of her faithful companion. These elements seemed to have awakened something inside the traumatized child. No longer was she a fragile vessel struggling to survive the assault of aggressive cross-examination. Instead, she was becoming a messenger of truth, a child finding her voice in the face of overwhelming odds. Ms. approached the witness stand with deliberate calm, allowing Emma a moment to settle, to place her small hand on his head, to feel the grounding presence of her protector. The prosecutor understood the psychology of this moment. Emma had been traumatized by the defense attorney's assault. She had been pushed to the edge of dissociation. Now, in the comparative safety of Ms.'s examination, she needed to rebuild her confidence and reclaim her narrative. "Emma," Ms. began softly, "I know you've had a difficult time during cross-examination. I want you to take a moment and just breathe. When you're ready, I'd like you to tell the jury in your own words exactly what happened on the day you're talking about. Not answering specific questions, just tell us what happened. Can you do that?" Emma nodded slowly. She took a deep breath, her small chest expanding and contracting. She looked down at, and the dog's amber eyes gazed back at her with absolute conviction. Then she began to speak. "It was a Saturday," Emma said, her voice still quiet but now carrying a quality of determined precision. "My mom had gone to the grocery store. I was in my room playing with my dolls. Uncle Robert came upstairs and told me he wanted to play a special game with me. He said it was a secret game that I couldn't tell anyone about. He said if I told my mom, she would be very angry with me." The jury leaned forward. This was no longer rehearsed testimony. This was a child recounting genuine memory, her words carrying the specific details that only authentic experience could produce. "At first, I didn't want to play," Emma continued, her voice gaining strength with each sentence. "But Uncle Robert said that if I didn't play, he would tell my mom that I had been very bad. He said he would tell her I had broken her favorite vase, and she would punish me. I knew I hadn't broken the vase, but I was scared that maybe he would make my mom believe him anyway." Emma paused, gathering courage for the more difficult parts of her testimony. Seemed to sense this moment of vulnerability and pressed his body more firmly against her, offering his solid presence as an anchor. "He told me to take off my clothes," Emma said, her voice becoming smaller but remaining steady. "I didn't want to, but he said all children did this with their uncles, that it was normal. He said my cousins did it too. He said that if I was a good girl, I could have ice cream after. I was confused. I didn't understand what was happening." A woman in the jury box wiped tears from her eyes. A man in the back row looked away briefly, struggling with the emotional weight of what he was hearing. "He touched me in places that made me feel very uncomfortable," Emma continued, the words coming faster now, as if once she had begun she couldn't stop the truth from flowing out. "He told me it felt good, that I was a special girl, that he loved me very much, but it didn't feel good. It felt wrong and scary, and I wanted him to stop. When I told him to stop, he got very angry. He said I was being bad, that I was ruining our special time together. He said if I told anyone, nobody would believe me because I was just a little girl and he was a grown-up with an important job." Emma's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained remarkably clear. She was no longer a frightened child struggling to answer confusing questions. She was a truth-teller, recounting her experience with the specificity and emotional authenticity that only genuine trauma could produce. "After it was over, he gave me the ice cream like he promised, but I didn't want it. My stomach felt sick. He told me that what happened was our secret, and that if I told my mom, she would not love me anymore. He said she would think I was dirty and gross. He said he would tell her it was my fault, that I had started the game. I was so scared and confused that I didn't tell her for 3 days." Ms. moved her questioning deeper into the specifics. "Emma, can you describe what your uncle was wearing that day?" "He had on tan pants and a blue shirt," Emma said immediately. "The blue shirt had a small stain on the pocket. He had his watch on, the shiny one he always wears. I remember looking at the watch and wondering what time it was, like maybe, if I knew what time it was, I could will the time forward to when it would be over. The specificity of these details, the clothing, the watch, the stain, were exactly the kinds of peripheral details that traumatized witnesses retained with crystal clarity. These were the markers of authentic memory, the sensory details that a fabricating child would never think to include. "Did this happen only one time?" Ms. asked gently. "No," Emma said, her voice becoming even quieter. "It happened 2 more times after that. The first time was 5 days later. The second time was 2 weeks later. After the second time, I finally told my mom because I couldn't keep the secret anymore. It was making me sick. I was having nightmares. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep." She looked directly at the jury now, and her small face carried an expression of such profound vulnerability and truth that several jurors visibly reacted. A man in the front row reached for a tissue. The woman who had been crying earlier now had tears streaming down her face. "I didn't want to tell," Emma said, addressing the jury directly as if she understood that they were the people who would decide her uncle's fate. "I was scared nobody would believe me. I was scared that my mom would think it was my fault. I was scared that Uncle Robert would be angry. But the secret was making me so sick that I had to tell someone, even though I was terrified." Ms. took a step back, allowing Emma's words to settle into the consciousness of every person in the courtroom. "Thank you, Emma. No further questions at this time." Remained seated for a long moment, clearly reconsidering his approach. He had attempted aggressive cross-examination, and it had backfired spectacularly. He had attempted to shake Emma's credibility and had instead reinforced it through her authentic, detailed recounting of her trauma. He stood slowly, and when he approached the witness stand, his demeanor had fundamentally shifted. His questions were brief, perfunctory, designed to establish minor points of clarification rather than to attack Emma's fundamental credibility. "You were 7 years old when these incidents occurred?" asked. "Yes," Emma confirmed. "And you're certain about the dates?" "I'm certain about the general," Emma said with a maturity that seemed beyond her years. "I know it was early spring because the flowers were starting to come up in our garden." Asked a few more clarifying questions, but his heart wasn't in it. The momentum of the trial had shifted irrevocably. He had attempted to destroy a child's credibility and had instead witnessed her reclaim her voice and her power. When he sat down, he avoided looking at his client. Judge observed Emma with an expression that blended judicial neutrality with unmistakable respect. The child had done what seemed impossible. She had survived the assault of sophisticated cross-examination and had emerged with her testimony not just intact but strengthened. As Emma stepped down from the witness stand, immediately moved to her side, his body language communicating pride and unwavering support. Together, they walked back toward the gallery where Emma's mother waited with open arms. The dog positioned himself between them, creating a triangle of connection and protection. The courtroom was absolutely silent. No one was taking notes. No one was moving. Everyone seemed to understand that they had just witnessed something remarkable, a child finding her voice, truth prevailing over manipulation, and justice beginning to emerge from the darkness of trauma and silence. The jury deliberation room was a windowless space painted in institutional beige, furnished with a single long table and 12 uncomfortable chairs. The 12 jurors who had been selected weeks earlier now sat in this confined space, tasked with determining the fate of Robert Hayes. Among them was the woman who had cried throughout Emma's testimony, the man who had looked away during the most difficult moments, the elderly gentleman who had shaken his head at the first indication of abuse. The foreman, a retired teacher named Mitchell, looked around the table. "I don't think we need extensive deliberation," she said quietly. "We all know what we saw and heard." The other jurors nodded in agreement, began moving through the evidence methodically, not because anyone doubted the verdict but because process mattered. Justice required procedure, even when the outcome seemed inevitable. She reviewed the testimony point by point. She addressed potential areas of reasonable doubt and explained why each one dissolved under scrutiny. Emma's specific details about her uncle's clothing, the watch, the stain on his shirt, the emotional authenticity of her testimony. The dog's protective response, which, while not admissible evidence, had revealed something fundamental about the truthfulness of the child's account. The man who had looked away spoke quietly. "I have a daughter Emma's age. I can't imagine what that child has been through. I can't imagine what her parents are feeling. But I can say with absolute certainty that she was telling the truth." A woman in her 30s, a social worker by profession, added, "The details she provided about trauma responses, the delay in reporting, the shame and fear, these are all consistent with what we know about child abuse. Nothing about her testimony sounded fabricated." The jury voted unanimously on the first count, guilty. They proceeded through each count methodically. Guilty, guilty, guilty. On every charge related to child sexual abuse, the verdict was unanimous. There was no disagreement, no hung jury, no reasonable doubt that would save Robert Hayes from the consequences of his actions. It took the jury exactly 4 hours and 15 minutes to determine that Robert Hayes should face significant prison time for the violation and trauma he had inflicted upon his niece. Back in the courthouse hallway, Emma sat with her mother and, unaware of the jury's decision, but somehow sensing that something significant had occurred. Her mother held her close, her entire body radiating a combination of hope and protective fury. She had sat through every moment of testimony, listening to her daughter describe the worst moments of her childhood, and had been forced to confront the reality that the adults in Emma's life, herself included, had not been able to protect her from this predator. "The jury has reached a verdict," an officer announced, appearing suddenly in the hallway. "All parties are to return to the courtroom immediately." Emma's grip on tightened. The dog's calm demeanor seemed to communicate that whatever was coming, they would face it together. As they walked toward the courtroom, Emma whispered to, "Whatever happens, we tried. We told the truth." The courtroom was packed. Every seat in the gallery was occupied. Journalists sat with notepads, cameras positioned to capture the moment when justice would either prevail or fail. The legal community had gathered because this case had already transcended its specific facts. It had become a landmark moment in how the courts would treat child witnesses and the role of trauma-informed support in the judicial process. Robert Hayes sat at the defense table, his face ashen. His expensive suit suddenly seemed like a costume, a disguise that had fooled no one. His lawyer sat beside him with the expression of a man who had already lost and was simply waiting for the official announcement. The arrogance and confidence that had characterized the trial's opening days had been completely replaced by the weight of impending consequences. Judge entered and took her seat at the bench. "The jury has reached a verdict," she announced formally. "Will the defendant please stand?" Robert Hayes stood on shaky legs. His hands trembled noticeably. For the first time since the trial began, he looked directly at Emma. And in that moment, something passed between them, an acknowledgement that the charade was over, that the truth had prevailed, that his world was about to irrevocably change. The jury foreman stood and handed the verdict sheets to the clerk, who read them aloud in the formal, emotionless tone required by courtroom procedure. "On the charge of child sexual abuse in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of child sexual abuse in the second degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of child endangerment, we find the defendant guilty." Count after count, verdict after verdict. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Robert Hayes's face crumpled. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, but Hayes seemed not to notice. He sank back into his chair as if the weight of the verdicts was physically crushing him. For years, he had operated under the assumption that his money, his status, and his carefully constructed image would protect him. He had believed that a sophisticated attorney and aggressive cross-examination could destroy a child's testimony. He had been catastrophically wrong. Emma watched him with an expression that was neither triumphant nor vengeful. It was simply peaceful, the peace that comes from speaking truth, and having that truth acknowledged by the system meant to protect society's most vulnerable members. Judge looked toward Emma and her mother with an expression that blended judicial neutrality with unmistakable compassion. She then addressed the courtroom. This case will be remembered not because of its legal complexity, but because of the courage demonstrated by a young witness and the commitment of this court to protect vulnerable victims while maintaining the constitutional protections afforded to defendants. Justice has been served today. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of reactions, some applauding quietly, some wiping away tears, some simply sitting in stunned silence as the reality of what had occurred settled over them. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Emma sat on a bench with her mother on one side and on the other. Judge emerged from her chambers and made her way toward the family. She knelt down to Emma's eye level, her judicial robes rustling slightly as she moved. "You are the strongest person I've ever met," Judge said, her voice thick with emotion. "Do you understand what you did today? You spoke the truth. You faced something terrifying and you didn't let fear silence you. That takes extraordinary courage." Emma looked at the judge with eyes that seemed far older than 8 years. "I had help," she said, reaching down to Stroke's head. "Help me be brave." Judge smiled, a genuine expression that humanized her judicial authority. "Is a remarkable dog, but the courage came from inside you, Emma. Never forget that. You have the power to speak truth, and that power will serve you well for the rest of your life." That night, as Emma lay in her bed with curled up beside her, she slept peacefully for the first time in months. The nightmares that had plagued her didn't come. The anxiety that had been her constant companion seemed to have loosened its grip. She had survived. She had been heard. She had been believed. The case would have far-reaching implications. Legal journals published articles about Judge's groundbreaking decision to protect child witnesses while maintaining constitutional protections for defendants. Universities added the case to their curriculum, using it to teach future lawyers about trauma-informed courtroom practices. Children's advocacy organizations cited it as a model for how the judicial system could be reformed to better serve the youngest and most vulnerable victims. But for Emma, the significance was simpler and more profound. She had reclaimed her voice. She had looked evil in the face and refused to be silenced. She had learned that even in a system designed to intimidate and confuse, truth could still prevail. And she had discovered that sometimes, the most powerful ally in the pursuit of justice is a faithful companion who sees you, believes you, and stands beside you unconditionally. 6 months later, Emma walked out of the courthouse on a bright spring morning with her mother, and the flowers that had been budding on the day of her trauma were now in full bloom. She wore a new dress, not chosen for its appearance in court, but for the simple pleasure of liking the color. She smiled at the reporters who still wanted to photograph her, not from obligation but from genuine contentment. Judge, watching from her office window on the upper floor, observed the small girl walking between her parents with a service dog at her side. The judge thought about the trial, about the moment when an animal's protective instinct had shifted the entire trajectory of justice. She thought about a child finding her voice, and the legal system stepping back to protect that voice rather than destroy it. Justice, she reflected, was not always about elegant legal arguments or sophisticated courtroom procedure. Sometimes it was about recognizing truth when it appeared before you, even when that truth wore the form of a frightened 8-year-old child and a dog who refused to abandon her. Emma's journey through trauma was far from over. Healing would take years. But on this spring morning, walking into a future that included safety, belief, and justice, she understood something fundamental. Her voice mattered. And that knowledge, more than any legal verdict, was her true victory.